Have you ever heard of a love so powerful it defied death itself? Or was it something far more sinister? The story of Nero, the fifth emperor of Rome, is not just one of power and politics. It's a chilling tale of obsession, beauty, and a grief that twisted an empire into the shape of one man's madness. The marble halls of Rome once echoed with laughter, but as Nero's reign wore on, that laughter belonged to him alone. Crowned emperor before he was even a man, he inherited a world gilded by conquest, but corroded by fear. He saw himself as an artist, a god, a savior. Yet beneath the gold and polished stone, a rot had begun to set in. In the perfumed air of the palace, senators bowed low, their whispered praises like prayers, and in their silence, Nero's shadow grew larger than Rome itself. They said his voice could charm the gods. When he stood on stage, bathed in lamplight, he sang of sorrow, beauty, and loss. But his audience knew the danger beneath the art. Every song was a confession, every round of applause a test of loyalty. In Nero's Rome, beauty wasn't worshipped, it was owned, and his most prized possession was his empress, Poppaea Sabina. Radiant, calculating, and worshipped like a goddess, Poppaea's beauty was legendary. Slaves scattered rose petals at her feet, and senators hung on her every word. But in private, the empire's golden couple were fire and oil. Their love wasn't devotion, it was combustion. On one suffocatingly hot summer night, their quarrel echoed through the palace. What began as accusations spiraled into fury. Whispers from witnesses would later claim Nero's hand struck her. She fell. And then, a deafening silence. When the emperor emerged, his eyes were hollow, his lips trembling as if a song had died within him. Poppaea, pregnant with his child, lay lifeless. The Empress of Rome, undone by the man who claimed to love her. The city froze. The empire had watched him murder his own mother. Now it watched him mourn his wife. But grief in the hands of a self-proclaimed god becomes something else entirely. A ritual, an obsession, a performance. Nero ordered Poppaea's body embalmed in the rarest spices and wrapped in alabaster silk. Her funeral was a spectacle of devotion. He knelt beside her golden bier, weeping so perfectly that even the statues seemed to watch. The public called it love, but true love doesn't demand applause. In the months that followed, Nero's grief became theatrical. He spoke to her as if she still walked beside him, building shrines filled with ivory and mirrors. The empire watched as their emperor slowly drowned in the reflection of his own desire. The line between mourning and madness blurred. He began to see Poppaea's face in every shadow, her voice in every courtly whisper. His grief wasn't just torment, it became his addiction. He had to possess that beauty again, and he would defy nature itself to do it. Whispers spread through the Palatine corridors. Nero commanded painters to recreate her likeness, sent servants across the empire searching for anyone who resembled her. At night, the palace blazed with torchlight, as if the emperor feared the darkness. While Nero was lost in his world of velvet and gold, the city of Rome suffered. The grain supply faltered and riots broke out. But senators who dared speak of famine were branded traitors to his grief. He summoned artists to craft new illusions, sculptors to carve her smile until their hands bled. But none of it was enough. Nero's Rome had become a theater, and he was its tragic god. His eyes changed in those days, a feverish glint taking hold. At grand feasts, he would toast to Poppaea's eternal beauty, while his guests sat trembling beneath chandeliers of blood-red glass. His laughter no longer came from joy, but from defiance, mocking death itself. The boy who once wrote poems under the guidance of his tutor, Seneca, was gone. In his place stood a man who believed the world could be reshaped by his will alone. He had killed his mother for freedom, killed his wife for control. Now, he searched for love again, not among the living, but among reflections. It was during this descent that he heard of a boy a young slave of unusual beauty named Sporus. His skin was pale as marble, his eyes soft, his features delicate. When Nero first saw him, the air in the room shifted. Witnesses said the emperor stood frozen, as if time itself had stepped aside. No one dared to speak as he approached the boy, his hand gently brushing the child's cheek. To some, it looked like pity. To others, a revelation. But those who knew Nero best saw something else, the familiar gaze that turned people into possessions. That night, torches burned until dawn. The emperor didn't sleep. He paced his marble halls, the sound of his sandals echoing like a funeral dirge. History would call what came next: love, madness, blasphemy. But in that moment it was something simpler. A man who couldn't let go of what he had destroyed. A god who couldn't bear the silence after his own creation had died. As dawn broke over the 7 hills, the emperor stood by his window, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His reflection shimmered on the glass, split between grief and hunger. Somewhere behind him, servants whispered the boy's name again. Sporus, a spark, a replacement, a resurrection. The empire that had conquered the world now prepared to watch its emperor wage war against death itself. He wouldn't raise armies or forge peace treaties. He would do something far more terrible. He would try to make beauty live again. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark heart of ancient Rome. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe for more tales from history, and let me know in the comments what you think of Nero's tragic obsession. See you next time. He was no one, a nameless boy plucked from the dust of servitude and thrust into the palace of gods. His name was Sporus, and in Nero's Rome, he had learned that silence was survival. He moved unseen through corridors where power devoured mercy, trained only to obey. When summoned before the emperor, he did not speak. He only bowed. Then, one day, Nero truly looked at him, and the air itself seemed to stop. The boy's face, delicate and solemn, carried an echo too cruel to ignore. The emperor's eyes widened, not with recognition, but with obsession. It wasn't the boy he saw. It was his beloved deceased wife, Poppaea, reborn in fragile flesh. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but grief sharpens imagination into madness. And Nero's imagination ruled an empire. In the days that followed, Sporus was clothed in silks heavier than his own body. Perfume soaked his skin until he smelled like the empress who lay buried in marble. The courtiers averted their gaze, pretending not to see what was unfolding. In Rome, survival often meant pretending to be blind. Whispers began only after doors were closed. The emperor had found a replacement, a mirror, a way to cheat death. The transformation began in secret chambers, beneath frescoes of gods and monsters. There was no ceremony, only a command, no priest, only the imperial physician. Steel met flesh under torchlight, and the empire stood still. The act was spoken of only in euphemisms, as though cruelty could be sanctified by poetry. They said it was done out of love, but love does not carve silence into a child. When it was over, what had been taken was not a life, but an identity. Days blurred into weeks. Sporus emerged again, not as himself, but as someone else. Draped in gold-threaded robes, crowned with pearls, the boy's reflection had been rewritten by the emperor's will. Nero named him Poppaea, and the empire obeyed. Nero called the act a wedding. He ordered a procession through the streets of Rome, with soldiers scattering flowers before them. The emperor wore a veil of purple. The boy walked beside him, trembling beneath the weight of jewels. Trumpets sounded, the crowds chanted, and priests blessed what they could not comprehend. This ceremony mocked both heaven and earth. Rome had witnessed triumphs of war, coronations and sacrifices, but never the death of innocents paraded as love. The people didn't laugh. They clapped with trembling hands, terrified of what silence might cost them. To displease Nero was to invite disappearance. His Rome was a stage, and every citizen an actor pretending to believe. That night, The emperor hosted a feast so extravagant it defied reason. Tables groaned beneath roasted peacocks, and fountains spilled with wine. Sporus sat beside him motionless, his face painted white, his eyes lowered. When Nero raised a cup and called him "my wife," the entire court cheered. But behind their applause hid a sickness older than power itself, the human instinct to worship even that which destroys. He lived thereafter as a shadow in the palace. The emperor ordered that he be addressed as Augusta, the title of an empress. He was carried in litters, attended by slaves, perfumed, adorned, and admired. Yet beneath the finery, he remained a boy hollowed out by obedience. He had become the emperor's reflection, beautiful, silent, and unreal. At times Nero would command performances in the palace theater. He would cradle Sporus before the crowd, his tears flowing with the precision of an artist. "She lives," he would whisper. "The gods have returned her to me." And the audience, dressed in silk and fear, would bow their heads and murmur their assent. In that place, truth was treason. Sporus rarely spoke. Some said he had forgotten how. Others believed he feared his own voice, knowing it could shatter the illusion Nero had so carefully built. The emperor's madness had become his cage, and every breath he took was another act in a play he had never chosen. But beneath the marble calm of the imperial household, tension coiled like a snake. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, whispered of revolt. The senators murmured of curses and divine punishment. Rome was restless. Fires still smoldered in its ruins, and famine lingered in its streets. Yet Nero saw none of it. His world began and ended at the edge of a mirror. From gilded windows, the boy who had been Sporus watched the empire decay, devouring itself as surely as the emperor had devoured him. At night, when Nero slept beside him, he would stare into the shadows on the ceiling, tracing the patterns of painted gods. He wondered if they were watching, or if they too had abandoned Rome. He was not a man. He was not a woman. He was something the empire had never named. Months turned into years. Nero's affection curdled into paranoia. He accused friends of betrayal, poets of treason, and soldiers of cowardice. He saw enemies in every shadow. Yet, when he looked upon Sporus, the madness would soften just for a moment. It was as if the boy's presence delayed his collapse, giving shape to his delusion. Sporus was his memory made flesh, his crime given beauty. The courtiers continued their charade. They bowed to the false empress and knelt before the emperor's lie. But whispers had begun to leak beyond the palace walls. The people spoke of a ruler who had married his own ghost. They spoke in fear, but also in awe. In Rome's long history of cruelty, this was something new, a sorrow turned spectacle, a wound crowned with gold. And through it all, Sporus endured. His every breath was a quiet act of defiance. He did not cry out. He did not resist. He simply lived. And in living, he reminded the empire of what it had become. A place where beauty could be broken and worshipped in the same moment. A world where love meant possession and mercy meant obedience. As the nights grew longer, Nero's grip on reality slipped entirely. He spoke to walls, to shadows, to the ghost of Poppaea he saw in the boy's eyes. The court grew quieter, the fear thicker. Even the marble seemed to absorb his madness. And yet, in the midst of that darkness, one truth pulsed like a wound. The emperor had not resurrected his wife. He had only buried another soul beside her. He was no longer Sporus nor Poppaea. He was only an echo, walking beside a god who feared ghosts. The story of Sporus is a chilling reminder of how absolute power can warp reality itself. It's a tale not just of an emperor's madness, but of a society that chose to look away. If you found this story as haunting as we did, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the darkest corners of history. Thank you for watching. The empire was sick. From the outside, Rome's marble monuments still gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, but beneath that polished skin, a quiet rot was spreading. The stones that once radiated pride now echoed with fear. People whispered of Nero, the emperor who sang while his city burned. The flames of the great fire were long gone, but their smoke still clung to the very soul of the empire. Inside the palace, time itself seemed to bend to Nero's will. The days no longer followed the sun, but the emperor's mercurial moods. He would wake at dusk, compose poetry at dawn, and pass judgment on men according to the rhythm of his own chaotic imagination. And by his side always was Sporus, a silent, spectral figure, his every step a command, his every breath an order. In the emperor's presence, the boy seemed less a living person than a memory, a beautiful relic dressed in ivory and gold. When Nero performed, the entire empire became his stage. He ordered senators to attend his plays, not as guests, but as a captive audience. He forced generals, men who had conquered lands, to applaud his poetry. At the back of the theaters, soldiers stood armed, not to protect the emperor, but to ensure that laughter and applause sounded at precisely the right moments. To not cheer was an act of treason. To show indifference was to sign your own death warrant. In this grand theater of cruelty, art had become law, and law had become a farce. At the very center of it all was Sporus. His face was painted, his silence was rehearsed. Nero called him Augusta, the name of his deceased wife. He sat him beside the throne, kissed his hand in public displays of affection, and wept over him in private moments of manufactured grief. Every gesture was a performance, every smile was a mask. For the court, this illusion was becoming unbearable, a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. And so they learned to act along. The Senate praised Nero's genius. The priests declared his strange love divine. Poets carved beautiful lies into marble, making them seem as holy as scripture. When one man claims to be both an artist and a god, truth becomes the ultimate treason. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, real suffering took hold. Famine gnawed at the city. Grain shipments from Egypt vanished, siphoned off by corruption. The poor roamed the streets like ghosts, haunted by their own hunger. But Nero's feasts only grew more extravagant, as if he believed sheer abundance could erase the suffering he refused to see. He hosted lavish banquets lit by gilded braziers, and Sporus sat beside him, a motionless statue amid the forced laughter of men pretending to live. Nero would raise his cup, gesturing to the boy and the opulence around them. "See how Rome adores us?" he'd declare. And Sporus would nod, not from agreement, but from a deep, paralyzing fear. It wasn't love that bound them, it was necessity. Nero's obsession with Sporus was both his shield and his confession. The boy's silent presence seemed to soothe the emperor's spiraling delusions, feeding them while disguising their decay. To the outside world, their union was presented as proof of Nero's divine passion. But to those inside the palace, it was terrifying evidence of his complete unraveling. There were nights when Nero would command musicians to play until the stars themselves seemed to dim from exhaustion. He would cradle Sporus on the balcony overlooking the sleeping city, whispering lines from Greek tragedies into the wind. His voice would tremble, not with guilt, but with a profound longing, a longing for an audience that would finally understand him, that would never judge him. In those moments, it felt as if even the night recoiled, as if the gods themselves had turned away, refusing to listen. The courtiers spoke in hushed tones, their words vanishing like smoke in the long, dark corridors. "He believes the boy is her," one would murmur, referring to the dead Empress Poppaea. "He can no longer tell the difference." Another would whisper, "He has made the dead jealous of the living." In Nero's Rome, knowing the truth was far more dangerous than open rebellion. And Sporus? He became the empire's most fragile and important secret. His every movement mirrored Nero's fantasy. His every silence was a calculated act of survival. He learned that even stillness, held for long enough, could be a form of defiance. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his eyes would drift toward the horizon beyond the Palatine Hill, where the real sun touched the Tiber River. It was the only thing left that the emperor's madness hadn't tainted. But even silence has its limits. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, began to stir. They were tired of his performances, humiliated by his bizarre demands. Rome's generals, hardened by real wars on the frontiers, returned to find their leader reciting tragedies instead of leading armies. In secret, letters began to pass between them, speaking the one word no one in Rome dared say aloud: rebellion. Nero, ever paranoid, sensed the shift before he could prove it. His feasts grew louder, his punishments more brutal. He accused senators of betrayal, poets of blasphemy. He even claimed the stars themselves were conspiring against him. Yet he could not turn on Sporus. The boy remained the one truth Nero could bear, the perfect lie that justified his entire reign. During one banquet, drunk on power and wine, the emperor demanded that Sporus sing for the court. A heavy silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to the boy. His lips trembled, but no sound came out. For a moment, Nero's eyes narrowed, his confusion clouding over with rage. But then, just as suddenly, he laughed. He kissed Sporus on the forehead and declared him a divine being, too holy to speak. The applause that followed was thunderous, desperate, and utterly hollow. Rome had learned its most important lesson. To survive, one must cheer for madness. Each day, the emperor's world grew smaller. His enemies multiplied outside the palace walls while his allies inside withered with fear. He began to believe that only the dead were truly loyal. At night, he stopped praying to Jupiter and started praying to Poppaea, to the memory he had tried to resurrect in the silent boy beside him. Sporus endured it all, the caresses, the performances, the crushing weight of the lies. He became exactly what Nero demanded, a reflection without a voice, a shadow without a self. But in that profound silence, a strange and unexpected power began to form. By refusing to speak, by refusing to participate fully, Sporus denied Nero the one thing he craved most, the complete illusion of godhood. The emperor could control his body, command his movements, even give him a new name, but he could not command belief. And so, the empire continued its descent into chaos. The Senate plotted. The legions conspired. The city whispered the name of a new leader, Galba, the governor who promised to bring an end to the madness. But inside the palace, Nero kept performing, his songs echoing through corridors filled with dread. And as he sang, Sporus sat beside him, unmoving, his eyes empty yet infinite. To those who watched, it was as if death itself had taken a seat at the emperor's side, waiting patiently for the final applause to end. While the Roman Empire began to burn from within, the emperor still sang, to a boy who could no longer even hear himself. Thank you for watching this story of spectacle and silence from the fall of Rome. If you found this glimpse into the past compelling, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell for more stories that history tried to forget. See you next time. In the heart of an empire forgetting its own pulse, Rome trembled not for glory, but for survival. Rumors, swifter than prayers, declared Galba's rise in Spain. The legions had abandoned Nero, and the Praetorians, once his iron wall, now whispered of allegiance to the highest bidder. Within the marble halls of the Palatine, Nero walked alone. The laughter had died. The torches burned low. Even the statues seemed to turn their backs. Following at a distance was Sporus, silent as ever, the last witness to a kingdom built on illusion. The emperor, who once demanded applause, now pleaded for love. He summoned senators who never came, poets who had fled, and soldiers who feigned deafness. The empire he'd adorned with music now spoke only in whispers of revolt. Still, he couldn't grasp it. How could a god be forsaken by mortals? Each night became a private performance. Draped in purple and gold, Nero stood before mirrors, his reflection fractured by candlelight. Sporus sat nearby, a living ghost, his eyes fixed on the floor. The Emperor's voice, once rich and confident, now quivered as he sang to a past that would never return. When the final note faded, silence clung to the air like ash. He turned to Sporus. "They will not leave me," he insisted. But even his reflection offered no reply. Beyond the palace gates, the streets howled. Mobs tore down his statues, spat on his image, and cursed his name. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state. Death, once a distant threat he dealt to others, now reached for him. And in that grasping darkness, only Sporus remained. They fled together under the moonlight, through gardens overgrown with ivy and neglect. The Emperor's purple cloak dragged in the dust, his jeweled sandals sinking into the mud. No trumpets, no soldiers, no crowds, only footsteps and the suffocating grip of fear. They found refuge in a decaying villa outside the city, the very place where he had once composed poetry to the gods. Now, he wrote only to himself. As dawn approached, Nero sat on the cold floor, his crown discarded beside him. He muttered to the shadows that he was still loved, still divine, still eternal. But the shadows only deepened, offering no comfort. It was then he turned to Sporus. "Will you weep for me when I am gone?" The boy's lips parted, but no sound came. His silence had become his only language. Outside, the thunder of hooves grew louder. The Senate's men were near. Nero trembled, not with courage, but with sheer disbelief. A lifetime of being worshipped had left him utterly incapable of dying like a man. His hand, shaking, reached for a dagger. History remembers his final words, heavy with the vanity that had defined his reign. "What an artist dies in me." Then, the blade fell. The room seemed to exhale, as if the empire itself had finally released its breath. When it was over, Sporus stood beside the body for a long time. The Emperor's eyes, once aflame with delusion, now stared at nothing. The silence in that room was heavier than any crown. The soldiers arrived to find no tyrant, only a corpse draped in purple, and a boy too quiet to grieve. The empire moved on. Galba entered Rome. Nero's name was cursed, his monuments defaced, his memory declared a disgrace. Yet even in disgrace he haunted them. The city could erase his face, but not the shadow he had cast upon every wall. Sporus was taken into custody, passed from hand to hand like a relic of a sinful age. To some, he was a curiosity. To others, a reminder too dangerous to forget. He was brought before Otho, one of Nero's former allies, who had also adored Poppaea. Otho treated him with a strange kindness at first, as if the boy's suffering could absolve his own guilt. But power changes kindness as quickly as flame consumes paper. When Vitellius seized the throne, cruelty returned in full force. The new emperor found sick entertainment in humiliation. He ordered Sporus to appear at feasts dressed as a bride, forced to reenact his marriage to Nero before drunken, laughing senators. Their laughter was brittle, hollow. The boy stood still, unmoving, his face painted white, his eyes fixed on a point far beyond them all. It was the final, grotesque act of an empire that had forgotten its own humanity. Sporus knew what awaited him. Another performance, another public death. They planned to parade him through the streets, to mock him, to force him to relive every moment of Nero's madness for the amusement of Rome. But the boy who had been made into a god's reflection refused to die as a spectacle. One night, before the command could be carried out, Sporus quietly ended his own life. There was no ceremony, no audience, no applause, just silence, the one thing Rome could never control. His death went unrecorded in the grand annals of triumph. But the few who remembered whispered that in that final silence lay the only truth Nero had ever truly created, that absolute power can destroy everything but shame. The empire marched forward as it always did, its wounds hidden beneath marble and myth. New emperors rose, each promising virtue, each secretly fearing the ghosts of those who came before. Yet Nero's story remained, not as a warning, but as a mirror, reflecting a world where beauty becomes possession and love a weapon. And somewhere beneath the stones of Rome, beneath centuries of worship and ruin, the boy's name still lingers. Sporus, the child who became a ghost in his own lifetime, the last witness to a god's undoing. History remembers emperors by their victories, but Rome, in its darkest hours, remembers the silence. It whispers of the boy who wore another's face, who lived in the shadow of a man too afraid to die alone. And in that whisper, the empire still trembles. Not for Nero, not for Poppaea, but for itself. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as haunting as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into the shadows of history. We'll see you next time.